Okay, so we got, my time says 7:02. Got my fantastic guest speakers with me. We've got a quorum of cool people that have joined us, and my system has not crashed yet. So it's a great time to get started. I appreciate everybody joining us tonight. Hopefully you'll see that title slide, glider transition for power pilots. And I will mosey right along and we'll get into it. What I would like for you to do is, if you've got, except for our speakers, leave your video on. If you're not a speaker, please turn your video off if you can and mute your microphone. During the course of the presentation, we're going to have Q&A at the end. If you've got something immediate that needs to be addressed or you just think of it, you can enter it in chat. George is going to help me monitor the chat. So if it's something that needs to be answered immediately, we'll break in and do that. And otherwise, we'll try to get chat questions at the end. And let's just dive into this. The purpose. I have found, because I talk incessantly about flying gliders to people at the Wings of Carolina Flying Club, that that occasionally people come up to me and they go, well, you know, I'm a power pilot and I want a glider rating. How do I do that? And so I give them some off-the-cuff answers. And I've always thought, you know, it'd be really good just to sit down and cover this in some detail so people really know how to do it. And then there's probably the most important question is, why would you want to do that? So why do you want to get a glider rating if you haven't already figured out that's something you want to do? And if you're a certificated pilot, private, commercial, or CFI, how do you add a glider rating to that? And we got the folks on this call that can answer those questions for you. On the agenda, I'm going to introduce you to the speakers. I will cover sort of the FAR view of what it takes to get an add-on glider rating. And then Jayne will talk about Bermuda High Soaring, and Jim will talk about the North Carolina Soaring Association, and we'll do a Q&A at the end.
Heinz, I don't see my screen.
You don't see your screen? What do you mean?
I don't see me.
Yeah, and I don't think, let's see, probably haven't turned your video on. Yep, I will fix that.
I don't need to see me. I just want to.
Oh, we want to see you. We definitely want to see you.
Okay, start my video.
Yep.
Would you want me to hit that?
Yep.
Okay.
There you go.
I see me.
That's good.
Hello, everyone.
All right, cool. And I will talk about our guest speakers. A lovely lady you just saw pop on your screen is Jayne Ewing Reid, and she's the owner of Bermuda High Soaring. And Jayne, I've known her for a long time. She's very well known in the U.S. soaring community and a real leader. Jayne began flying gliders in 1978 when she was just a college kid. She learned to fly power planes in a Citabria, first solo in 1982 in that. Jayne got her first ag plane, which is a Pawnee, that she named Blue. We'll see some pictures of that later. And she began towing gliders in 1988. Jayne set 32, I said 32 state soaring records in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. She's an accomplished contest pilot. She's competed in 13 world, national, and regional contests. I said she's well known in the U.S., a frequent contributor to the Soaring magazine. She received the 1997 Soaring Society of America, or SSA, Exceptional Achievement Award, and she received the 2001 Warren Eaton Memorial Trophy, and that trophy is considered the SSA's highest award, and that's given to a person who's made an outstanding contribution to the art, sport, or science of soaring flight in the United States. Of equal importance to me, Jayne is a tailwheel enthusiast, and she owns and flies a Piper Cub and a Cessna 185. She also owns and competes in the DG-808 18-meter sailplane. In addition to her accomplished aviation career, Jayne is a registered nurse. So, Jayne can teach you how to fly, she can tow you up and get you in the air, and if you get hurt, she can patch you up. So Jayne can do it all. Our second speaker is Jim Hotelling. Jim Hotelling is a glider instructor at my glider club, the North Carolina Soaring Association, and he has the dubious distinction of teaching me how to fly gliders back in the 2000-2001 time frame. So any bad habits that I have are Jim's fault. Jim got his glider add-on rating in 1971, and as an aero engineering student at NC State, he was one of the founding members of the North Carolina Soaring Association in the late 70s. During the same period, he was an instructor, and he says the only one, as far as he can remember, for the Chapel Hill Flying Club back when it was small and still in Chapel Hill. And so Jim and John and George can sort that one out. Jim moved away from North Carolina and left both clubs in 1980 to continue a professional career in aviation and in particular flight test. He is a test pilot, and he graduated from the Naval Test Pilot School in Pax River in 1983. Jim came back to North Carolina and he rejoined the NCSA and continued his glider flying when he returned to the Chapel Hill area in the 1990s. He went to work for the UNC Hospital for 2 years flying Tar Heel 1, and that was the Carolina Air Service Air Care helicopter, the medevac helicopter, and then for 23 years flew airplanes for the UNC flight department. In 10 of those years, he was the director of that flight department. Jim is an ATP with over 14,000 flight hours. His ratings include glider, helicopter, seaplane, multi-engine, type ratings, and military and civilian helicopters. Jim's flight instructor certificate includes glider, multi-engine, helicopter, and instrument ratings. So I'm pretty sure with the combined expertise and experience of our guest speakers, any question that you have on this subject, they will be able to answer. So what does it take to do a glider add-on? If you have a private pilot certificate, and the assumption there is you're going to have at least 40 hours of flight time in heavy and air aircraft, it doesn't require a written test. You have to do a check ride. You have to do the training that leads you up to 10 solo flights in a glider, and then you do check ride prep. Easy peasy, nothing to it. Well, that's what I thought back in the day, and it took me about 7 months to get all that done. So I'm just probably a slow learner. A commercial is similar. You got to have a commercial flight experience, at least 200 hours. Any power commercial pilot's going to have more than that. Instead of 10 solo flights, you need 20 flights, pilot and command, which would be solo flights, and then check ride prep. So those requirements and the check ride are similar, more solo flights required for commercial. And then for our flight instructors, you need to have a commercial glider rating. You need to have at least 15 hours pilot and command in gliders, and you need to be endorsed. And Jayne can tell you a little bit about how they do that down at Bermuda High. Bullet down at the end, most of you might know this, but you don't need a medical to fly as pilot and command in gliders. My good friend Woody Cannon, who's one of our glider instructors and an AME, reminds us that we self-certify, but the FAA is not involved in that process. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jayne, and she can tell us all about Bermuda High soaring.
It's a pleasure to be here, and Heinz, I thank you very much for the invitation to address your students and your colleagues, and thank you very much for having me on your Zoom presentation. I actually live right here at Bermuda High Soaring, so I can pretty much, when I'm quarantined at home, I'm pretty happy. I'm right here on a big grass field, so I can go out to polish some airplanes and perhaps even fly. We're located south of Charlotte, not too far, about an hour from Charlotte, an hour from Columbia, and an hour from Florence. Probably from Raleigh, it would be about 3 hours to say, comfortably 3 hours. And we're located right there on the edge of the MOA, but we don't have any difficulties with the MOA at all. We communicate with them. I've got a straight line right to the tower if needed. So we've worked with them. We've been here since 1991, and we started operating in 92, I believe, here. And we have 3 233s. I don't have a photo of the whole fleet, as Jim later will show you their planes, but we do have 3 233s, and you'll see various shots of those. And we have 3 126s, and one of the 126s is open cockpit, which is an unbelievably weird feeling, and then it's a lot of fun to fly that. So we keep that one just for the fact that it's got an open cockpit, and we like to look down and pretend that the only thing that's keeping us in there are some straps. So that's kind of fun to fly. We have a PW5, which is a Polish fiberglass single seat plane. And we have a duodiscus, which you can see on the screen in the corner up there. And that's a beautiful state-of-the-art fiberglass 2-seat cross-country airplane. We have one of those that we use those to transition people into their single-seat glider, and also to do some rides, some introductory rides, but we don't use it for primary training. It's a bit too advanced for that, for primary training. Next slide, please. We can go to why get a glider rating? The short answer is it's a heck of a lot of fun. This is the video, okay? This is a 233. This is what we train in. And this was a film crew that came down and made a really nice video for us. It was actually for them. They were students in a film class. But we use the duodiscus. That's one of our Pawnees. We have 3 Pawnees because it takes 3 to keep 2 running. They're workhorses. There's always something that's going to happen to them. And we're taking off to the south here. And on any grass field, it's going to be a bit bumpy. We strive to keep one area of this field fairly smooth. The roadside, if you fly in, you want to land on the roadside. That's the side that doesn't let the water run off. There you can see some of the trailers. When you first get airborne, you need to stay very, very low. You do not want to get above that tow plane, because you can actually drive his nose right into the field. And being a tow pilot of many, many years, I stress that point, that you need to be in a lower tow position, just for caution. There I am hooking up, and that's another one of our 233s. Yes, I took some design, so I got creative with the paint scheme. The 233 is a great trainer. It takes a while to respond. When you want it to go to the right, you need to move the stick to the right, and then you need to pick up your leg. You move to forward more to the right, and then it'll go. You just have to give it a little bit of time. Whereas this duo, it'll turn on a dime. You just move it very, very gently, just some pressure, just a little bit of pressure, and it's just a dream to fly. It'll go right where you want it to. For the landing, when you're in the, that looked a bit bumpy, but when you are actually in a fiberglass plane, you want to drag that tail in first, tail and main together. But when you're in a 233, as this one is, you're going to flare and land on that main wheel. So they do land differently. Fiberglass planes land differently than the 233, have the capability of landing differently. And so you want to make sure if you're going to be landing out that you land at a very slow airspeed, low energy, and bring the tail in. It's fun to fly all types of gliders.
And Jayne, I kind of interrupted you to transition to that video, and maybe you can talk a little bit about why do these guys want to get a glider rating, and what are the benefits of that?
I think you want to get a glider rating if you enjoy aviation and you have a sense of adventure and you want to try something different, something that's going to hone your aviation skills. I think it's an art more than it is actually just flying. You can get in a Cub and you can fly, or you can get in a Twin and fly, and you're going to go from A to B. But when you climb in the glider and you say, I'm going to fly to Hartsville or I'm going to fly to Darlington, you may or may not get there. And you can make the decision along the way whether you turn back. It's all based on what your altitude is. So flying cross country is really, that's something that you can strive for. The first thing is to just learn how to fly the glider and realize that it's not the engine that causes you to fly, it's the wings. So if you've got a nice wingspan, you've got quite a glide ratio. And if you lose your engine in a power plane, you pretty much you're gonna land right down there. But when you are in a glider, you may have 23 to 1, you may have 50 to 1, which means if you're at 5,000 feet, you can go 23 miles before you need to think about that before you get to the 22nd mile. But you need to give yourself quite a bit. Well, they call that, you dial that in. It's called safety margin there for 1,000 feet for your pattern. When you learn to fly gliders, you don't have any of the oil pressure to worry about, the oil temperature. You don't have gas to worry about. What you have is just your basic instruments in there, your altimeter, variometer, airspeed indicator. And I like to cover that stuff up sometimes because you don't need an altimeter when you fly gliders if you're going to land out. You need to get that sight picture in your head. But my point is, I'm trying to get to is that when you land, you don't add power. When you're coming in on final, you better have what you need when you arrive on final, because you can get rid of the altitude, but you can't gain altitude. So it teaches you how to judge your pattern, where you are in relation to the field, and it's just a different type of flying. It gives you a whole nother skill set for aviation, for flying power planes. And you learn to use your feet. You learn to keep the airplane coordinated, because the glider will tell you if you're not coordinated very quickly. You can hear the sound of that. So why should you get one? Only if you enjoy a different type of flying and a challenge, because it's limitless in what you can do. You can learn to fly a glider and just learn, all right, turn to the right, that sort of thing. Or you can learn to thermal and fly with the birds, and you'll spot a turkey buzzard, or maybe that's a hawk. There's more of them in a gaggle, and so you'll go to that area. You'll learn to think about the atmosphere. You'll learn a lot about weather. How you interpret a cumulus cloud is going to be totally different than what you interpreted before. You interpret it as turbulence and a nuisance, and we look at a cumulus cloud and we just stare at it and go, that's a thing of beauty, because it's climbing. That hot rising air underneath of it's climbing, and when you go under it, you'll get a little bit of sink on the outside, because everything what must go up must come down, what goes up must come down. So you will have sinking air, but when you come underneath that cloud, you'll feel it. You'll learn how to sense the airplane's movement, and really learn to listen to the aircraft, and learn how to fly on updrafts. There's other types of soaring as well. ridge and wave. I just mentioned those, but what we have here is thermal flight or wave at certain times of the year. But that, I think you should get a glider rating if you really want to expand your aviation skills and horizons. And you can, it's limitless. Actually, it's limitless. I'm still learning. And we can just briefly talk about the courses. That's the next slide. There's the beginner course that we offer is to someone that has no experience whatsoever. And I realize I'm talking to a group of transition pilots. So each pilot will come to us with a different type of experience. And a lot of that depends on how go through the flights. We say the average is 12 dual flights. It may be 15. It really just depends. It may be 10. It's not going to be much less than 10 because we're going to go through the emergency procedures. We're going to go through a simulated rope break. What do you do if the rope break? We're going to, what if the engine quits in the tow plane? We'll go through the emergency procedures. So it's going to be probably, let's just say 10 to 20 flights, and you'll learn how to fly tow. I think that's probably one of the most challenging. You know how to fly the airplane because you know how to turn to the right, turn to the left, and what the ailerons do and what the rudder does, and you just need to put that together coordinated. But you'll learn the new skill is actually flying formation with the tow pilot. That's the first thing that you'll realize, that you have absolutely no idea how to do that. It can become a challenge. After you master your skills and your towing and your airwork and your pattern and where you are in relation to the field and how to use your spoilers to adjust your altitude as to what you need, either save your altitude if you need to, or you can always get rid of a little bit of altitude spoilers. After you do that, then you do 10 solo flights for your private add-on. You can add a private to a private without a written. You can add to a commercial glider. 20 solo flights are the requirements to add to a commercial. The advantage is simply the check ride is tweaked a little bit for commercial. They're a little more strict. They want you to land within 200 feet and that sort of thing. But basically, your check ride is the same. So if you have a commercial and glider rating, it'll say private privileges glider. So if you don't want that, you can just add a commercial glider onto it. While you're doing it, you might as well add your commercial. And you'll need 3 flights for recommendation and your check ride. Because you may be in Raleigh, you can come down for 3 to 4 days, or we can do it in a series of weekends. It really matters not. For flight instructor, the FARs require 15 hours, PIC and glider. That's the FAR, but we require a bit more. We recommend 30 hours. Flight instructing in a glider, and I'm sure Jim can add to this, is much different than flight instructing in power. There's some, you don't have anything to get you out of a situation if you let it go too far. So you really have to be on top of the situation and stay within your comfort level, because if you do a rope break, you have to be right there and be ready as an instructor. And it's also good to learn how to thermal so that you can pass that part of the sport. That's the fun part, to get off at 2,000 feet and go up to 5,000 feet at cloud base, and go from one cloud to another, and go to a field if you think there's lift there, and so that takes some time to learn how to do that. And I think flight instructors need to be versed in soaring as well. And so those are the courses. And next slide, please. It's a good idea to come prepared. And what Heinz was saying, that he thought it was going to be easy. it is easy, but it just is like anything else that you're learning. Everything's easier when you're well prepared, or at least when you have some background, because the instructor is not going to be able to give you all of his information, you know. So there are some books that we recommend that you read before you begin flying. People will come up and they'll say, well, I want my first lesson. Okay, but it's best if you have this knowledge beforehand, so that you have something to draw from, so that when we say something, you at least have read about it, and now we can actually put the maneuver with what you read about. The Learning to Fly Gliders by Bob Wander, it's a great syllabus. Bob's been teaching for years and years, and he's written a great series of books called Learning to Fly Gliders and Learning to Fly series. And one of his books that we use is a flight training syllabus. And it's very short, concise. It's only $20, and it's well worth it. It'll tell you all the things you're going to do to screw up, you know, right there on the ground from the get-go. And one of them that I like is the fact that you leave the canopy open. Well, you never leave the canopy open. You always close it, because a gust of wind is going to take that canopy and blow it open and crack it, and now you've ruined your day. So, you know, those little things are in Bob's book. So that's great. The other one that's free, it's free, and it's on the FAA. I'm dropping them everywhere. The Glider Flying Handbook, and Heinz has been kind enough to put the number there, FAA.Hotel 8083 13A. If you put that in the FAA.gov website search bar, it'll come up with a downloadable free book. And that book is great. It's got a lot of information in it. And it's, again, the word is free. And read that, and that'll help with a base of knowledge for flying gliders. Covers everything. The other book that we use, which is fantastic, is Russell Holt's book, and that one is great for training. If you're interested in a CFI for teaching gliding, that's an excellent book, because at the end of every chapter he has a series of questions, and that allows a starting point for each lesson, because you can, when you're teaching children, when you're teaching kids or youngsters, young man, young woman, when you're teaching teenagers, it's a great tool, because it's, okay, did you do your questions at the end of the chapter, and do you have any questions about that? So it's a good starting point where we can talk about things like boxing the wake and the tow plane. They're going to do that anyway. Boxing the wake is you have the wake of the tow plane, and boxing the wake is maneuvering behind that. But when you're first learning to fly gliders, you're just going to be all over the place for a little bit. You have to use your feet. Okay, I'm teaching, so let's go. If you would, please, the next slide. These are some photos of the 126, and that's a great plane to fly. It's very responsive, so you go from the 233, which you can see here's two of our 233s in these photographs. That's Mike, one of our instructors, and these pictures are from the this past January. Students from the Governor's School for Science and Mathematics, extremely intelligent students. They're just great. And so we have a week that we taught each winter. We teach kids. I love teaching kids. And then the other photo there is the single seat plane that you'll go into after the 233, and that, as you can tell, is very responsive. The elevator is extremely responsive. It's got a nice little roll rate, and it's just a joy to fly. The green one in the background, that's the one that we have the open cockpit for. And when we go to contests, we put them on trailers, and I just found that photo, and I thought it was pretty unusual because we actually have 2 126s on one trailer. We don't have that trailer anymore, but that was quite a trip to go to different contests. And so those are the 2 planes that you'll start out in, are the 233 and the 126. They're common throughout the United States. Next slide, please. We also have, after the I want to say fabric 233, it's actually aluminum, fabric, tubing, steel tubing. Then you get into the composite planes, and these are what we call higher performance planes. They have a better glide ratio, a higher glide ratio. Most of these planes are made in Europe, if not all. Well, no, some of them, there's a couple planes that are made in the US. But we have contests, we host contests, and we made the field 4,000 feet long. And the reason we did that was not because we expected power pilots to fly in, but we did that because when we're training, that gives us a great leeway, if you will, to allow them to, if you forget your spoilers and you go 2,000 feet, well, we've still got 2,000 feet more for you to remember to open your spoilers. So that, that's great for teaching. So it's also wide enough if you drop a wing and you start going off the end of the edge of the runway there, we can catch you before you go too far off to the right. And you will drag a wing. These planes can drop a wing. They carry water. If they drop a wing, they're going in that direction. So you have to be very careful when you're launching this type of aircraft if they carry water ballast, which is a whole other story, but that gets you through the air faster because you're heavier. It's great fun to compete with one another, and the competition is to go to different points, and the person that gets around that triangle or around that course the fastest gets the most points for the day, and everyone else is devalued underneath that. You might get 1,000 points, and the next person might get 800, 750, and it goes onward. So we enjoy this part of supporting the sport. The Soaring Society of America, we host sanctioned contests, and this is just part of the sport that we like to support as well. It's another aspect of it. And I'll be happy to answer any questions later on, Heinz, at the end of the presentation.
Thanks, Jayne, and we will turn it over to Jim now.
Okay, well, thank you, Jayne, for that very articulate description of what's involved in glider flying, and I particularly like your emphasis on it being a sport. And Heinz, thank you for that great introduction. I'm going to assume everybody can hear me okay, unless you speak up and tell me not. So I'm going to talk about the NCSA, North Carolina Soaring Association. It's a pretty small, low-key, informal club compared to Jayne's and other commercial operations. And it's located out in Franklin County, east of Raleigh. It's kind of halfway between Raleigh and Rocky Mount. It's notoriously hard to find by car, and eastern North Carolina is pretty flat. Even by air, it's hard to see, being a dirt strip. There's a little tiny picture up in the corner of this slide that shows how it's kind of a cut in the trees. It's 2,500 feet by 80 as opposed to Jayne's 4,000 by 200. And it's also uphill. It's got trees on the side. So when you learn to fly with us, you succeed in several ways. Notice also there's a pond, several ponds down there. So if you like fishing, you can bring your fishing pole out there. It's a lot more rural than even Sanford Lee County Airport. It's pretty rural, but this is way out in eastern North Carolina, so it's quite cultural change from coming from, say, the Triangle area. It's really out in the farmlands. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what it's like to come to us and take a flight or transition. And I think we're ready to go on to the next slide, which is a video. And we can, if you would wait a moment, Heinz, to start that, and I'll just tell you about, you know, how to find us. I mentioned it's hard to find in a car. It takes an hour or so from the Triangle area, so you have a kind of an all-day adventure with us. As far as scheduling, I can answer questions later on that, but essentially we do schedule ahead of time, but it's not an exact time. If we have students waiting to fly and a scheduled ride doesn't show up, then we go ahead and put the students in the air, so there's some waiting involved. There's been a question about what time of year or what weather you need to take a flight or try us out. And certainly winter is cold. The heaters don't work so well in the gliders. But even, you know, the heat of the summer is pretty rough on folks. It's can be really hot. So I might suggest spring or fall to come out to try us out. And then the time of day, of course, morning tends to be cooler and smoother. So less lift, it may not stay up so long, but it might be a better time to try out a glider. And then later in the day, if you want to really experience the thermals and more lift. We do offer commercial rides, even though we're a non-commercial club. What that means is if you come out to take a flight with us, the first rides until you join the club are really pay as you go, and our insurance says you're really not even supposed to touch the controls. If you come out to fly with us, we'll spend a lot of time pre-flighting and briefing and talking about what's about to happen. We use the T-33 that, excuse me, 233 that Jayne has shown pictures of, and it's good in some ways, but part of the requirements is to fit in the glider, and we take a lot of time to make sure you have the right cushions, the controls are adjusted to match you. Then we have to be concerned about weight and balance. The whole aircraft's only so many 100 pounds, so a little shift of weight's a big difference. So we have ballast to put in place there, and we'll, before you fly, we'll point out some of the glider elements like the yaw string in the front, and you know what we're looking at. There is an issue with communication. A lot of people think, well, gliders are real quiet. Well, it turns out especially the 233 there's a fair amount of wind noise, and communication from back seat to front seat is not automatic. I can talk into your ear, but sometimes I have students or people taking a ride that have soft voices that I have to tell them to turn around, and I just point out kind of what to expect. It's not like having an intercom system. Why don't we run the video, and then I can kind of talk about what you're experiencing along with that, or finish up afterwards. So takeoff, tow, pattern, and landing. The takeoff, sometimes with the 233, it rocks back on the tail, and it's pretty noisy and bumpy, and so it's a busy time. You notice the glider actually lifts off before the tow plane, and as Jayne emphasized, we can't allow the glider to go too high because you can actually ride the elevator on the tow plane, so that's something to watch out for. Now, on tow, as Jayne mentioned, it's pretty intense, and it's somewhat like formation flying. I'm trying to relate it to people's past experience. Turns out some people don't have experience with formation, so this is something new. I should mention later that formation flying comes up again in thermaling when you're in a gaggle. If there are other aircraft, other gliders in the lift with you, which happens, then that's another aspect of formation flying. Sometimes I try to explain the tow is sort of like 3D water skiing, which again, sometimes people haven't water skied before, but it's kind of analogous in that if you stay in trail right behind the tow plane, you go the same speed. But if you start whipping out to the side, then you can increase your speed compared to the tow plane. And if it's really bad, you'll end up passing the tow plane, and then you have slack rope. And so we want to train you to not do that. It's just part of the challenges of being on tow. The workload on tow is so high and so different that often on the first flight, I will suggest not even letting the student or the passenger try it. So this is landing at Crooked Creek, and you see it's trees and short and it's uphill. So it's a challenging field. One thing I'll say about towing is what I've seen is kind of a tendency towards beginners having what I would say is a lateral PIO. And you all know PIOs, you think of them in airplanes as like bouncing the nose wheel on landing and porpoising if you're going too fast. And of course, the solution is to just go around. So on tow in a glider, what I've seen is a beginner will do fine at first and then kind of drift out to one side and put some correction in the other way. Nothing much happens because of the sluggish roll rate, and then they put in more correction, and then the glider starts shifting back the other way. Well, they go too far, and the process repeats the other way, and pretty soon they're out of phase with it. So it's a time for the instructor to step in, take the controls back, and restabilize it. And I have to emphasize to transition pilots and beginners also that it's normal to do this. And sometimes people feel bad, like they can't fly very well because they got out of phase and had to have me take it back over. But that's normal. So I have to keep reassuring students that everybody does this. You know, it's okay for me to take it back and we'll restabilize. And so towing is probably the hardest skill to pick up for glider flying, I would say, depending. From towing, let's see, the flying itself is kind of straightforward. The first part of it is simply that the glider is reasonably stable. If you take your hands off the controls, it doesn't just fall out of the sky. As many people are aware, it tends to be sensitive in pitch, but sluggish in roll. And of course, there's lots of adverse yaws requiring good use of the rudders. And in the first flight, maybe straight ahead stall shows you that it's very benign. There's nothing particularly different about that. You do notice that flying slowly, the near, say, slow flight, the rudders are almost controlling bank and vice versa. The ailerons are controlling direction due to all this adverse yaw. Now for the pattern and landing, in Heinz, I'm still running on my sheet of notes here. If you want to run the video again, you could. Maybe it's appropriate or maybe not. But I was going to talk about the landing in a glider. We use 1,000 foot above the field as our pattern entry. From downwind, really the pattern and landing is, in my mind, similar to the power commercial check ride where you do the 180 power off approach and the spot landing. We do have the advantage of being able to use spoilers. So if you have the wisdom to deploy the spoilers a third or halfway out in the pattern, that means you have some option when you turn final. If you're short, you can push forward like a throttle and go further. On final, we use that kind of stick and rudder method that Wolfgang Langeweische talked about in his book, of your intended landing area is on the windshield, and if it drifts up, you're in trouble. You're short. If it drifts down, you're good. So the glider flying really emphasizes this skill and perspective, the visual perspective of things, as opposed to exact numbers. And I think that's one of the attractions to me. The landing, as the slide's got no video, but landings, at least on our grass field, are noticeably noisy and perhaps bumpy depending on the field conditions. So that can alarm people. I feel like I have to warn them ahead of time about that. So basically that's a brief description of what a beginning flight would be like. So moving on to our club and scheduling, I mentioned that we have an online system, and if we can, at the end of this presentation, we'll give out contact information and we can help you schedule if you want to come. We have a rotating schedule of instructors, so which one you get may depend on what day it is and who's on the schedule. And there are pros and cons of this. You get different instructors with different perspectives and ideas and ways of saying things may be good. On the other hand, there is a great advantage to sticking with the same instructor if you're in a more intensive course. This also means, since we fly on weekends, our training program will stretch out over time. Different instructors may have, a different way. They want you to repeat a maneuver to show them. So standardization between instructors is an issue for us. Often what we do is spend a lot of time on the ground briefing the flight with the student before we go fly, and that's usually out on the aircraft, and that's probably not as good as a classroom with a more formal presentation. We do have a clubhouse. So to our advantage, this system of kind of on-the-spot briefing is perhaps more fluid and less rigid and more personalized in some ways, but it also can make for some kind of slow-paced days where people are waiting and the instructor's out there talking too much, and it would seem like. So it does stretch out compared to a carefully scheduled commercial operation. Again, on the plus side, we do listen to students and are patient and try to address their concerns. One of the jokes one of the pilots made at our field was, if we were a commercial operation, we'd be out of business because we go at a pretty slow pace. So you want to be prepared for that when you come out. Let's see what else I got before this slide. I don't think flying gliders or learning gliders is particularly difficult. It's just different, like getting a seaplane rating or a tail wheel checkout or acrobatics or helicopters. So it's just different. We have our own glider characteristics with all the adverts yaw. We do, one point is that we can appeal to a younger audience. The FAA lets 14-year-olds solo. And so that can be a draw for some kids or parents with kids that are looking for something constructive to do, but it does raise questions about youth and learning styles and responsibility, maturity. And so we do emphasize making sure to interview potential younger students about what their motivation is, why they're out there, what do they really want to do. And we ask them to complete some bookwork, some ground school ahead of time to kind of help demonstrate that they're serious about it. Jayne mentioned the medical requirements, and yes, the Part 6153 is a self-certified regulation, and so essentially it's up to you to determine that you're healthy to fly. And Jayne brought up a good point about some parents bring kids out. Turns out they're on some strange medicine for ADD or something, could be a factor. And so flight instructors end up being, taking on the responsibility of kind of counselor or, evaluator, psychologist. So, any flight instructor is that way, but even more so with 14-year-old kids. We got one now that's really sharp. He's been on the simulator for years, I guess, and he flies better than me. He can kind of do anything. So now the challenge is to be sure that we've checked off all the blocks before we solo him. He was ready to solo at 14, but then all this coronavirus stuff hit. Let's see, there was questions about weather forecasting skills, and essentially we can start with the same products that power pilots use, but we end up paying more attention to some things. For gliders, there are dedicated glider websites. I know George mentioned there are such things for balloon pilots. So that's an option, things you can learn about. Some of them are free and some of them cost a few bucks a year. But let me move on. Let's see, I was going to talk about our aircraft here. Maybe we could go to the next slide, George, and see. These look familiar from Jayne's presentation. And so to run over the same ones, on the upper left is the R233. A little more about it. It is All-American, the Schweitzer from New York. It's an old design, a classic American training glider. It's tube and fabric, metal wing, and modest glide ratio, like 22-to-1 at about 40 knots or so. And it has known shortcomings. And I'm glad to hear that Jayne mentioned also that quirk about you can't get full lateral stick deflection unless you raise your leg. And you can try to adjust cushions and adjust the controls, but it's not a good design in some ways. Let's see, ours, I wrote down some of the weights, 648-pound empty weight. So you can see people in it makes a big difference in where the center of gravity is. Max gross 1,040. So the useful load, if you take away my weight, would get down to around 227 pounds. So in theory, that's the maximum we can weight that we can take for a potential student or passenger. We have issues if the center of gravity is too far aft, then you can run out of forward stick on toe. So that's not good. And like other gliders, it's known for light pitch forces, but slow roll rates. They are not expensive though, so they're useful in case you damage one, you can just go ahead and get another one. And the wing loading is down around 5 pounds per square foot for those of you that are interested in that. The next one, the 126, is the lower right one with the red nose. Our single seater. Ours are not as pretty as Jayne's, I can see. So it is a great single seat trainer, and that's good for post solo students. It's a lot more fun to fly, more responsive, and it also offloads the two-seat trainer so that we can keep students involved without collaborating the schedule with 233. Also, the 126 does have a national club for competition that Jayne referred to. And for reference, it's 487-pound aircraft with a max gross of 700 pounds. So 213 pounds is the magic number. You're not supposed to fly that if you weigh more than 213 pounds. But we have a solution, and that's the Lark. Okay, on the left side, the Lark is a Romanian two-seat all-metal aircraft. We'll use that for commercial rides. It's heavier, but it has pretty good performance in terms of a glide ratio. It's up in around 34-to-1 and a little faster, 54 knots, so you can actually go somewhere. Empty weight, 882 pounds, and by the time you take away my weight, you end up with 254 pounds, so we can take passengers up to 254 pounds in that. Although, of course, flying and getting into and out of gliders requires some agility, and so like on the phone or by email ahead of time, we're trying to determine not only what people weigh, but if they have any handicaps or issues that would prevent them from actually climbing in or out of. Sometimes there are, tall or large folks that just won't fit. So how to tell them no gracefully is one of the challenges. Back seats are typically smaller. And so you see our two call air tow planes there. And we're fortunate to have two. We do have a simulator. Also, it's one desktop type simulator. It uses the Condor program, which is like other flight simulator programs, but specialized for gliders. And that's good for rainy days. And also, it can be integrated pretty well into our flying program, but it's a little bit catch as catch can. And there are downsides to simulator training. Actually, there's negative training, reverse training here, where the control touch is different from the actual aircraft. It's good for pointing out cause and effect and you know, what's connected to what, but I'm a little reluctant to, I'm a little worried when kids come in and all they've done is, you know, landed the simulator. Let me move on now to our membership. I think I may have mentioned there's only 30 or 40 of us, and some of us are senior power pilots, some ex-military. I can point to people in this in this diagram. I think Heinz here and there is one of the senior club members, but the owner in the middle picture on the left with the leather jacket is Frank Sweat. He's a retired military colonel, and it's thanks to him and we have the field available. In these, on the left side, the fella in the plaid shirt is a accomplished glider pilot, Colonel Kleber, who flew P-51s, I think F-86s, F-100s. He was a commandant of Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, and so he's been towing for us, but he turned 93 now, or maybe 94, so he's retired from towing. You know, age is not a limit here, by the way. And then on the right side, you can see Woody Cannon, as Heinz mentioned. He's one of our instructors. And our designated examiner in the middle picture next to Frank, the smallest guy, is our newest examiner, Gary Garavalia. I'm not sure I can pronounce his name, but he has the great attribute of being small and light, so he can fit with some of our larger people in the gliders. So a lot of our members are kind of steeped in aviation. There are a lot of members that are professionals in other careers, and they're just trying to come out for sport or to get out of the house. And then the members sometimes bring their families along, and they either take rides or sign up as members themselves. We have college students and high school students, and of course, my favorite are the North Carolina State Aero Engineering students, because it makes instructing easy. They already know all the principles, and you kind of show them things once and say, that's what you do, and then they can do it. So that's pretty amazing. And some of us have our own gliders, and so we use the field as a place to keep them and fly out of. Some of our alumni are very successful. They've gone on from gliders to power to airline careers, and one of our members' daughters is now flying helicopters in the Navy. We're like other clubs with a board of directors, you know, the president and vice president, treasurer, ops guy, chief instructor, and we do have bylaws and SOPs. We're pretty informal, so sometimes it takes us a while to get around to addressing those concerns. Our model, our business model, is all volunteer. No one gets paid. So that can make a difference in the emphasis of your training. And let's see, I mentioned scheduling before. Let's see, let's move on to the next slide, Heinz. And it shows our, oh no, I'm sorry. That same slide showed one of our, can you go back one, Heinz? On the lower right is 126, which is, experienced the land out. You know, the big fear in my mind when I started flying gliders is, God, will I have to land off the airport somewhere? And of course, that's constantly in your mind. I've had bad experiences landing off airports, so I try to avoid it. But here's a case where one of your, meaning Wings of Carolina Flying Club power pilots came over and wanted to learn fly gliders. So he found himself one day out of range of the airport. So you could criticize that, but I think that's an understandable mistake, and things could come up with strong wind or whatever. But the great thing, and you talk about example of, you know, ADM, aeronautical decision making, and then all these FAA acronyms like DECIDE. Well, this is a wonderful example of aeronautical decision making where he saw he wasn't going to make the field, so he made the decision to go ahead and commit to the best available field that he could make, which, as you can see in the background, was it may have been a plowed field, but no crops there. So what does that DECIDE acronym? Is something like, well, you detect change, estimate what you need to do, you know, choose the outcome, and then actually do the necessary. So this guy did a great job. He landed with no damage to the aircraft, and we all, piled into our trailers and cars and went over there and had a good time disassembling it, putting it on the trailer and hauling it back. And our club rule, though, is that if you do that, then you, the person that landed out, have to buy dinner for everybody. All right, thank you. Enough of that slide. All right, I'll try to finish up here. The last slide has to do with cost. Now, the slide has to do with the foundation which helps support students. Our cost is perhaps something we should go into in question and answer, but it is, I would consider it nominal, but our treasurer came up with a list of prices, but it does cost something like $200 to join unless you're a student, and it's only $50, and then I think the dues run around $60 a month, and the individual flights with tows, typically a 3,000-foot training flight is something like $60 or $70, and it's not exorbitant, but there may be a lot of them. So I can't add it all up at the moment, but I will say that this Soaring Foundation, started by one of our members, and it's the recipient of some generosity on part of Colonel Kleber and others that has got enough money in it to actually pay 2/3 of the training, as it says here, for qualifying students. And so that's worth looking into if you are one or have a kid that meets those requirements. Let's see, what else have I got here? The cost, and then the questions, and I'll just wrap it up with anything else we can leave to question and answer. I think I had a couple more points, but I'm not going to bother digging in too much, get into them too much. So thank you all, and when I find my last sheet of notes, I'll answer questions about it. So I appreciate the patience y'all have with our sort of amateur presentation, but it should help, I hope.
So I know that everybody is fired up and ready to go take glider training. So this is how you get started. I've got a link to this presentation in the Club Learning Center. So all this stuff is available on that link. But that's where you go.
Yeah, I think the only other things I was going to mention besides cost was safety. We do have a safety program. We're very conscientious of safety culture. We have the senior folks oversee operations and try to stop things bad before they happen. We emphasize going slow and methodical, and then we do have an annual safety meeting. And then for the future, what I've been talking about is basically coming out and transitioning, getting your FAA certificate, but then after that, the future is limitless. There's, as Jayne mentioned, there's cross-country and competition. And I like to mention that there's always learning and there's always ways to increase your performance. And glider flying is high performance. And I referred in the past to the glider altitude record now is 74,000 feet or so in the Perlin project that's funded by Airbus. So there's a lot of adventure out there if people want to come on out. And thank you for the time.
And now we'll open it up for questions.
How long does it take a power pilot to get over the panic when they don't hear an engine running?
No problem.
They hear an engine running when it's the tow plane.
Jim, on that video of landing at your strip, what was the pilot doing with his left hand? His right hand was on what looked like a conventional stick. What was he doing with his left hand?
Yeah, that was me. That's the throttle. Or I'm sorry, we don't call it a throttle. It's a spoiler. So if you, and it's like push to go, like most airplane throttles. If you have it halfway out at the beginning of your base to final leg, then you can use it to go further or land shorter as you wish. So you do have a lot of control over your exact touchdown spot.
Do you forward slip a glider for altitude?
Definitely. yeah, that's one of the important skills in your training is learning how to. Although I have a saying about the 233, like you can never be too high in the 233 because, you know, if you're really high, you can do a 360. But essentially, if you go to full rudder and balance it with, you know, a bank in a full slip and increase the speed, it'll come down real steep. So that slipping is part of it. One of the check ride demonstrations there are, you know, abnormal procedures is for the examiner to stick the spoilers shut or in some intermediate position and tell the candidate, the applicant, to land without using or changing the spoilers. So then you have to become proficient at slipping to get the glide angle you want.
So is a spoiler kind of like a manually adjustable speed brake?
Exactly.
Yes.
So the terminology spoiler or speed brake they have slightly different meanings, but we kind of all know what you mean. And whether you want to spoil lift or add drag, they serve both functions in different amounts in different aircraft.
What's that kind of look like on a glider? I mean, I know what speed brakes are on a power plane, but what's the spoiler kind of look like on a glider?
Well, maybe one of these pictures shows it, but generally there are long, thin boards that are parallel to the wing that may be only 6 inches high, but they're neatly folded into the wing, and when you deploy them, they pop out. Usually they're painted orange or something so that people know they're deployed, because it's they're not useful for takeoff. They just spoil lift, and so we'd like to know that they're out. And some gliders have the spoilers.
Left-hand corner.
You see one there?
Yeah. There's both of them are open on the 233s.
Oh, on the upper left, yeah, I see.
here.
They're white and green.
Here are the spoilers here.
There's spoilers on some aircraft are only on the top of the wing and some on the bottom. And by the way, Mooney, I guess the Flying Club Moonies don't have them. The Moonies I was flying at the UNC flight operation had spoilers on the top surface to augment roll control. So some like airliners use those too, I believe, for adding drag.
Jason had a question. Jason Kelly said, do either facilities do winch towing?
No.
Well, so not at Crooked Creek. If you remember those videos of the trees, really tough to run a winch there. So what about Bermuda High, Jayne?
We used to. We used to do it. We don't do it now because the insurance company says that we need to use Spectra line, which is a line that gives and not steel. And when I spoke to the winch designers at a SSA convention once, they were from Germany, they said that because we have a hump in the middle of the runway that we needed to use steel cable, that we didn't need to use Spectra line. It was safer to use steel cable. So because we couldn't get insurance for what we needed, we just recently sold the winch to Spartanburg, and Spartanburg now has 2 winches. They have ours and their own, and Larry's working on it to reconfigure it for Spectra line. But we're not going to get it back. So if you want a winch, then I would suggest Spartanburg, South Carolina.
Yeah, I don't know if they're still doing it, but from time to time, the club at Spartanburg would have winch clinics where they would invite folks to come in here and get some winch training.
Yeah, I would add, in my understanding, where the North Carolina Soaring Association used to operate a winch when we were at Wilson Airport with no obstructions. But I believe they're useful for shorter fields, or if you're like at the edge of a cliff, like Torrey Pines in California, then you can throw people off the cliff with a winch in a sense. And you may get some utility that you wouldn't have if you don't have a very long runway. But I will add that it's fun, and it's probably the closest thing to a cat shot you can take on in gliders. That it's kind of a talk about a regional reverse command. Once you're off the ground, kind of like the harder you pull back, the faster you go. So it can be exhilarating. Although the way we were doing it, we only got in the equipment we had, we only got like 800 or 900 feet. So you're already at, below pattern entry altitude. Now some winches can go a lot higher, and if it's a good day, it might be sufficient to get away from the pattern and launch off on a cross country. But it's just another skill, and it's a lot of fun. It does require a lot of upkeep on both the line you use and the winch itself is not a minor consideration. They're rare and pretty expensive. So anyway, I'd love to try it again, but we don't do that.
Great, thank you very much.
Any other questions? I don't see anything on the chat, and if there are no more questions from the floor, I think we can wrap it up. And I would like to thank again our guest speakers. Really, really interesting discussion about these operations, and I appreciate your time and your willingness to join us.
Heinz, I have a question for Jayne. Okay. Can we organize a club fly-in down to your landing strip? I'm not keen on sending our pilots over to Jim's landing strip. I'm not sure we can afford that. But could we organize a flight down there someday?
You'd be most welcome. I look forward to seeing you. Of course, that would be great. That would be super. But Jim has the advantage of when you learn to fly there, you learn to land in a field. So, if you're going to go cross country, there's a little airstrip that's 12 miles from here, and it's called Kirk Air Base, and it sounds huge, Kirk Air Base. But it's about maybe 2,000 feet, trees on both sides, a lake on one end, and a pond on the other, and a hill in the middle. And when you go in there, you don't quite know exactly what is going to be your first decision. What about the hill downhill, land downhill? Well, they're both downhill, and there's water on both ends. So when you can land at that field, you can pretty well put it where you need to. So I think there's an advantage of that. That's one thing we get. You've got such a nice open field here. That's true. But when you can put a 126 down in the driveway, that's saying something. So.
Well, we've got members who learn to fly on a 6,000-foot paved runway.
That's true.
With clear approaches on both ends.
That's true. I've forgotten a normal air.
We've got some work to do before we're doing 2,200 feet. But
yeah, I'd love to have you down. Just give me a call and we'll schedule a day and hope for good weather. And if it's a rain out, we'll schedule for another day and for some sun.
I think that would be a great cross-country day trip for the club. We'll talk about that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And if there are no other questions, we can call that a wrap. And again, thanks to our speakers, and thanks to everybody for joining us. I got a video recording of this. Hopefully it'll turn out, and we'll post that as well.
All right. Well, thank you, Heinz.
You bet.
Thank you very much, Heinz.
Good night, all. Stay safe.
Good night.